you can see in my outline, my paper aims at pinpointing some long-lasting issues and debates tied with live coverage of football games and news stories dealing with this subject during the two first decades in which television was able to produce outdoors live shows and stories. The lasting presence of newsreel stories produced in-house or purchased from news agencies in the news programs and sport shows is the first matter I wish to consider in this presentation. Further, I wish to mention briefly some of the most remarkable reactions and debates launched in Eurovision member states by the first live TV coverage of major football events. I will mainly focus on the example of France. Doing so, and because we do not have the time to do that differently, I will limit myself to evoke the contribution of technological innovations such as the Ampex and the Vidicon tube. We could have mentioned the zoom, the Camiflex camera, the instant replay, the contribution of color. Finally, the spotlight should be turned on the curation issue and the potential digital accessibility of football film archives. First, I wish to stress a crucial fact that appeared increasingly obvious to me the more I did research on the history of TV football. The attention of media and sports historians has always been much more focused on live coverage than on the stories produced to be aired in news and sport shows. Well, as far as the edification of the great stadium and the sedimentation of consumption rituals is concerned, this is certainly a lacuna. I checked it for the main European football nations over and over again, everywhere, during the years of state monopoly, in the programs of public TV corporations, the total duration of live football emissions is clearly inferior to the amount of time devoted to what Germans call Konservenfußball, and which may be translated in French by football en boîte, football en conserve, and preserved football in British English, or canned soccer in American English. As a matter of fact, TV football stories long obeyed the rules of a specific genre of documentary cinema, the newsreel films. At this stage of my presentation, I now need to shed some light on the relation of football and cinema. It stays quite unhappy as far as fiction is concerned. A good fiction film dealing with football as a sport is a very rare item of popular culture. The best films about football are actually more focused on fandom and fan identification. I think of movies like Pitch Fever, Looking for Eric, or Das Wunder von Bern. Let's name two main factors generally mentioned to explain this matter of fact. By nature, sports is averse to all external dramaturgic measures. It lives mainly from its surprising moments and from the aura of it that it gains from its being rooted in the here and now of live happenings. For the audience, it is real competition, no matter the level of competitors, which provides the best screenplays. As Sepp Herberger said, crowds go to the stadiums because they do not know for sure how it will end. If the presence on the stadium stands is not possible, live TV coverage is generally considered the second best option. In the case of football, much more than for other sports and games, like, for example, boxing. The lack of realism and rigor of game phases recreated by cinema is a crucial aspect of things. To quote Nick Hornby, in a film about football, you always have to face the great dilemma. Or you hire actors who cannot kick the ball, or you hire football players who cannot act. Now, just in contrast, you will think of Will Smith as Ali and Robert De Niro as Jake LaMotta. And still, despite the fact that one can hardly name a decent fiction film focused on football as a spectacle, it may definitely not be questioned that until the second half of the 70s, the visual memory and history of football is mainly based on celluloid film. I want to stress here that the mentioned period of the 70s is only relatively pertinent. For example, in the case of FR3 regional TV stations in France. For my PhD research, I interviewed Charles Giraud, retired cameraman from FR3 Strasbourg, he confessed that even in the 80s, he would be sent to football games or other sports events on Sunday afternoons only equipped with a 16mm Bell camera that may be considered as a semi-professional material and one or at the most two 9-minute film cartridges. His mission was always to shoot the essential pictures at minimal cost, since the means at disposal were limited. Today we face an inverted problematic because everything's shot and posted on the net, no matter the quality. A closer examination of corresponding list of TV news programs produced by the French public corporation RTF and then ORTF and archived at INA clearly shows that for the coverage of sports events and especially football games, 16mm material, often newsreel material, not produced in-house but bought from news agencies, constituted the majority of news stories and items of topical interest broadcast during TV news shows until the 70s. Despite all their limitations, newsreels had soon become massive and powerful visual narrative conveyors of football events as early as the late 20s. Contrary to the widespread assumption, it is improper to affirm that they were supplanted by TV in the 50s. Initially, live TV coverage only started replacing the cinema screen as the medium allowing audiences to see moving pictures of a football event for the first time. Newsreels were still released and programmed weekly in most European movie theaters, ritually preceding the short film and the feature film until the late 60s or early 70s. I now come to the second major point of my presentation. During the first half of the 50s, the development of a reliable live coverage changed it all, and at once, as far as the relations between football authorities and TV corporations were concerned. Since it is not the main topic of my presentation, I will only briefly mention this aspect of things. Although television's technical shortcomings stayed evident for years, certain wise observers sensed in these premises the triumphant advent of televised football and sports commodification. Using Norbert Elias' terminology, they perceived very early the three main position figuration televised football would form in Eurovision member states. Despite all possible national variations, namely in terms of dynamics, they identified the fundamental stakes underlying the turbulent relation binding football authorities on one hand, TV corporations, and on the third position, this social group that is fluctuant by nature and generally designated as the public or the TV audiences, and of course the radio-electrical industry is one of the major actors recurrently occupying this third position and interfering in this figuration. The above-mentioned observers were often actors of the field of sports and media. They produced professional theories in which scholar may miss conceptual depth or scientific rigor at a certain point. This gap is then again, especially in the eyes of an historian, compensated by the precocity conferring a visionary character to the expressed opinion. A very good and entertaining example is given by the press cartoonists for whom TV football coverage became a recurrent subject. For the relations between TV corporations and football authorities, it seems quite impossible to me to find a sharper press cartoon and a sharper vision than the one produced by Jean-Jacques Sampé for France Football in 1957, after the French Federation had refused the broadcast of France-Hungary, programmed on Sunday afternoon on October 7th, 1956. Official reason mentioned by the Federation, the protection of grassroots amateur football clubs and the receipt at the stadium gates that a live broadcast would supposedly have considerably harmed. Now, I guess you will enjoy the talent of these press cartoonists, who in the case of Aro, here, illustrated the invasive character of live football being watched anytime, any place by male audiences. This press cartoon also shows clearly which social class could afford a TV set in Vacation at the Beach in 1957, at the beginning of what Geoffroy Dumazier named La Société des Loisirs. Concerning the paradigmatic shift from the ear to the eye launched by reliable live TV coverage, one can find numerous cartoons which wittingly play with the possibility that viewers may be abused by the pseudo-reality shown on the screen. For my thesis, I have listed and reviewed dozens of articles in which top journalists like Willy Meissel for Germany and England, Gabriel Hanaud and Jacques Ferrand for France, or star players like Fritz Walter, Raymond Coppa, or Alfredo Di Stefano felt the urge to reaffirm quite solemnly the preeminence of a physical presence at the stadiums, in the stadium stands over a mere vision of a game on the TV screen. Doing so, they also justified the purchase of a sports newspaper which would provide the TV viewer with an analysis based on a three-dimensional observation of a game, the latter barely eyewitnessed on the screen, and improperly most of the time. Especially in this first period, professional critics and viewers expressing themselves in the pages of the sports and TV done by the technical crew and criticized quite harshly the performance of the commentators. And I guess that if you surf the net today, you will find quite certainly that nothing has changed much under the sun. Most people expressing themselves about football broadcasting are quite clueless when it comes to deliver a fine analytical approach of a TV director's work. They mainly remember verbal comments. A few observations gleaned in a press review of the two first games broadcast by French television shall help you to grasp how deep the impact of novelty was on the audience and the professionals. The Finale de Coupe de France is, of course, the highlight of the season's end, and the friendly France-Germany, played in Colombes in October 1952, was the first game between the two nations since 1938. Around 1,000 TV sets was sold in Paris and surroundings during the 3 last days preceding the game after its live broadcast was officially announced. It was a real rush then. Quite a few commentators, like Herbert Zimmermann, and known in Germany as the voice of Bern, and Georges Briquet, La Voix du Tour for France, often switched from radio to TV and vice versa during the early days of TV in the 50s. Their comments were still influenced by decades of professional practice. They had gimmicks that were linked to their being a radio reporter before. They often appeared hysterical, redundant, and off-key when they worked for TV, despite the good comment that was given about Georges Briquet in the press. I selected, and now we have to be a bit slower, I selected this picture at the INA archive, at the Inatech, commenting this camera. Go back just 1 second. This is a TV camera. Now, what is he saying? And it's during the story in the news, in the evening news. Yeah, you can see that he's confused about being talking about cinema or TV. It's a TV camera that people see, but the film that they see actually is a 16mm film. So, continue. At the end of the story, he commenting this image, he will again speak of a televisor and you all have seen that it was a press photographer. Yeah. So the question is, it was Georges Briquet confused and only, improvising and just talking, not to have a silence while he was in the cabin, or was he kind of tremendously nonchalant, betting on the audience being clueless about what they saw? A few words about the technological innovations I mentioned. In March 1959, the magazine Radio TV informed its readers that French television had acquired equipment allowing the adaptation of technical means of live TV broadcast 2 cinema cameras. Loaded with 16mm film reels, these were equipped with a Vidicon tube, a sort of electronic viewfinder, showing on a control screen the image that the camera was actually taking. This would, of course, help to save a lot of time, material and money, since the director could immediately see and choose the picture he wanted to keep. The quality of the product was definitely superior to kinescope. Kinescope was the means that they had before the videotape to record. They would film on 16mm film what was passing on the screen. So you would lose sharpness, and on the sides of the picture there was a loss of contrast and color. Yeah. So, and also you saved precious amount of time required for development. Also, this camera was not yet adapted to transportation and climate hazards and was to be confined to television sets for 2-3 more years. Its beneficial contribution to the production of sports stories was a central argument in the journalist's article. The video recorder was invented by Ampex in 1956. Its distribution started the very same year. Peter Dimmock, legendary BBC sports broadcaster, obtained to purchase one for the BBC outside broadcast services he managed as soon as 1957. This was a very expensive item. It was so expensive that the ARD, the German TV ARD, could only buy 2 second-hand equipments from CBS the year after, in 1958. The RTF could not follow its German and British equivalents immediately because engineers from Thomson had to first solve the problem caused by the specific picture definition in 819 lines adopted in France. The American technology had to be adapted to the local standards. It took them over a year to do that job. Nevertheless, as soon as June 1959, Philippe Marchal published a quite technical article in L'Équipe in which he developed visions of the Ampex impact, mainly on the visibility of football games on the TV screen. At the end of 1959, Philippe Marchal published another article in L'Équipe addressing one of the most significant potential contribution of Ampex to sport broadcasting, the production of retrospective shows based on the recording of live events. The retrospective shows were already a classic program during the holiday season between Christmas and New Year. This kind of project sheds a crude light on a loophole in the policy of most TV corporations. It is characterized by a constant lack of attention granted to a patrimonial approach of their own activities and productions. Marchal mentions that in 1959, French television was just unable to produce such a 45-minute show without buying the aired stories from the film press agencies working in Paris. The majority of great events had not been recorded with the Ampex that was already at disposal because of the cost it would imply. And in case that a recording had been operated, it was always done for control purposes, relying on the kinescope process. Of course, the result could not be used in a prestigious show between Christmas and New Year's Eve. Concluding his article, Marchal mentioned that a putative argument to be signed soon by French television and national football authorities would probably confirm the breakthrough of Ampex in France. I now come to my conclusion. I'm fully aware that I could have focused on dozens of other aspects linked to my topic of the day. For example, with more time at disposal, it would have been very interesting to focus on the introduction of instant replay and slow motion during the World Cup 1956. All the more since I already gave a presentation in a free conference in Stuttgart in 2012, but I guess Yvan Gastaut, who will address kind of the same subject, will do that on Thursday morning. I could also have evoked in detail the extremely sharp articles published in L'Équipe by a journalist named Michel Labruni from 1966 to 1970, especially the pages he wrote, the articles he wrote on the contribution of color to the success of the 1970 World Cup. So, allow me as a historian to finish my presentation evoking what should constitute our bread and butter, but too often ends up looking like our holy grail for which we have to endure uncertain quests: usable archive material. Especially on the eve of an event like the Euro 2016, audiovisual archives usually fuel an array of programs stretching beyond mere compilation. In the past decade, massive amounts of audiovisual contents concerning football have been made accessible online, on all sorts of homepages, on video sharing sites, and on the portals of dedicated projects and institutions. The opportunities and challenges are obvious to stakeholders in the football audiovisual heritage sector. First, these collections of audiovisual material need curation before they can grow to be meaningful as living documents of the European and international political, social, and cultural history. Ideally, curation creates a context for heritage that makes it relevant for our present, makes it speak to us and help us understand our history and our future. Considering, for example, the websites of UEFA and FIFA, one may note easily that neither of them have devoted, up to now, the necessary funds to make archive material concerning their greatest contests enduringly accessible for football fans and for research. Maybe the FIFA Museum, inaugurated by the new FIFA president at the beginning of the week, or last week, a few days ago, will give a few reasons to nurture great expectations about radical changes, positive changes in that matter. Wait, watch and see. Thank you for your attention.